Millennials have been called a lot of things, and almost none of it is fair. The broke generation, the avocado toast generation, the ones who can't save, can't commit, can't grow up, can't stop spending money on experiences instead of building real wealth. I've heard every version of that conversation, and for a long time, I half believed parts of it. Then I started actually looking at what was happening to this generation in real time. Not the headlines, not the think pieces, the actual numbers, the actual timeline, the actual sequence of events that shaped every financial decision they made. And here's what I found. Every single money habit that looks irresponsible from the outside makes complete sense once you understand what they were responding to. Not personality, not laziness, not avocado toast. System failures, one after another, right at the exact moments it mattered most. Last video, I walked through Gen X, the generation that saved everything and trusted nobody. Their habits made sense too, once you understood what they'd watched happen. This one is different. Same era of economic instability, completely different response. And understanding why the response was so different tells you something important about both generations. And honestly, about money itself.
I want to lay out a timeline before we get into the habits, because the timing is everything. Millennials, born roughly between 1981 and 1996, graduated into the worst recession since the Great Depression. Not into a challenging job market, into a collapsed one. And what that does to a generation's relationship with money, I don't think most people fully grasp. Entry-level positions that required 5 years of experience, unpaid internships as the only door in, salaries that hadn't moved in a decade, while carrying student debt that had doubled in the 10 years before they arrived. I spoke with a millennial woman who described finishing her degree the same week Lehman Brothers collapsed. She said, "I did everything I was told to do. I got the grades, I got the degree, and I graduated into nothing." That sentence stayed with me. Because it wasn't just her, it was an entire generation, graduating into a world where the contract they'd been sold had just been quietly canceled, and nobody told them. That experience doesn't just shape a bank account. It shapes how an entire generation thinks about money, security, risk, and trust for the rest of their lives. I'm going to walk through 5 millennial money habits that most people misread. Not to excuse them, not to defend them, but to explain exactly where each one came from. And why, once you understand the origin, the behavior stops looking irrational and starts looking like the only logical response available. Let's go.
They don't trust the stock market, and they have receipts. The first thing I noticed when I started talking to millennials about investing was a specific kind of hesitation that I hadn't encountered with other generations. Not ignorance, not laziness, something more like wariness. A quiet, "I've seen what happens" energy that made them cautious in a way that was hard to explain without knowing the backstory. So I asked. And the backstory was always 2008. Millennials were 12 to 27 years old when the financial crisis hit, which means their first significant exposure to what the stock market actually does in real life to real families was watching 401ks get cut in half overnight, watching parents who had done decades of responsible saving suddenly have nothing to show for it. One man I talked to told me his dad lost 40% of his retirement savings in 6 months. He'd been putting money in every month for 20 years. It was just gone. He paused. I didn't open a brokerage account until I was 31, and even then, I felt like I was doing something dangerous. That's not financial ignorance. That's a trauma response with a very specific origin date. Standard advice to just invest in index funds and don't look at it lands completely differently when the first real thing you saw markets do was erase a parent's life savings. But the stock market wasn't the only door that closed on millennials at the exact wrong moment. There was another one, and for most of them,
it never fully reopened.
Experiences over assets. The math nobody does. Millennials get criticized constantly for spending money on experiences instead of saving for a house or building long-term assets. I heard this framing for years before I actually looked at the housing numbers. In most major Tier 1 cities, London, Sydney, Toronto, New York, LA, house prices rose somewhere between 2 and 4 times faster than wages during the first decade millennials were working. Not slightly outpacing, structurally out of reach. And here's the part that actually stopped me when I looked at the numbers closely. I talked to a woman in her mid-30s who had been saving seriously for a house deposit since she was 24, and what she told me genuinely stopped me. By the time she had enough for the deposit she'd been targeting, the required deposit had grown faster than her savings. She laughed when she told me. Not a funny laugh. I was running towards something that was moving away from me. So here's the question that nobody actually asks when they criticize millennial spending, and I think it's the most important one. If home ownership, the traditional path to building wealth, is out of reach for a full decade of your prime earning years, what do you do with the money instead? The answer a lot of millennials landed on was spend it on experiences, on things that have value now, on life that can actually be lived while you're young enough to live it. I'm not saying that's the smartest financial move. What I am saying is this. When someone removes the traditional path, people find another one. That's not irresponsibility. That's adaptation. It wasn't avocado toast. It was a quiet adjustment to a different set of options. And there was a third door that closed, one that shaped the millennial relationship with money in a way that most people still haven't fully connected to the right cause.
Student debt paralysis, the contract that expired. Millennials were told a very specific thing growing up. Education equals security. Borrow what you need to get the degree. The degree opens the door. The door pays for everything. That contract made sense when it was written. It stopped making sense somewhere around the mid-2000s, and by the time most millennials found out, they were already committed. This next conversation is the one that changed how I think about the whole topic. I sat with a 34-year-old who had a master's degree, a good job, and hadn't made any meaningful progress on retirement savings. He knew he should be contributing more. He knew the numbers. He'd read the same articles everyone else had. But every time he thought about putting money into a system that had already broken a major promise to him, education would lead to financial security, something in him resisted. It's not that I don't understand compound interest, he told me. It's that I don't fully trust the system to be there when I need it, not after everything. I've thought about that conversation a lot since. Because what he was describing wasn't irresponsibility. It was the logical response of someone who had followed the rules, paid the price, and watched the promised outcome not arrive. Why would you trust the next promise completely? Student debt isn't just a financial burden. It's the receipt for a transaction that didn't deliver what it advertised. And that receipt affects every financial decision that comes after it. But here's what's interesting. Out of all the ways millennials adapted to a system that kept failing them, one response was actually ahead of its time, and most people frame it as a flaw.
The side hustle wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was insurance. Millennials are obsessed with extra income streams, multiple sources, multiple backups, never depending fully on a single employer for financial survival. Most financial commentary frames this as a generational quirk, always grinding, always looking for the next stream, an inability to settle, a restlessness that gets in the way of doing one thing well. Every millennial I talked to about this had a different explanation. They'd watched their parents get laid off. Not in the abstract downsizing wave Gen X experienced, but specific, personal moments. A parent coming home early with a box. A family dinner where the word restructuring appeared for the first time. The understanding, absorbed at a young age, that a single income from one employer was one weak point that could collapse everything. I've never had just one income source, one woman told me.
Even when I've had a full-time job I loved, even when I wasn't worried about money at all, the idea of depending on one company for everything just never felt safe to me. I asked her if she thought that was a Gen X influence. She'd grown up watching that generation navigate the downsizing era. She thought about it. Probably, but it's also just what I saw happen. You don't need to be told something twice when the first lesson was that clear. Freelance and contract work didn't create the millennial instinct to diversify income. It just gave it somewhere to land. And when I understood that, the extra income stream started looking less like always grinding culture and more like the most reasonable risk management decision available. The same instinct Gen X had, just expressed differently in a different economic landscape. But there's one millennial money habit that I found hardest to research, because it's the most invisible one, and it's doing the most damage.
Financial anxiety despite earning more than their parents did at the same age. This one took the most conversations to understand, because on paper, it shouldn't exist. Many millennials earn more on paper than their parents did at the same age, and yet the financial anxiety is often more intense, not less. The feeling of being behind is more persistent. The sense that something is wrong, even when the numbers look okay, doesn't go away. I talked to a 38-year-old who, by every external measure, was doing well. Good income, stable job, some savings. He said, "I make twice what my dad made at my age, and I feel more financially insecure than he ever seemed to." I asked him why he thought that was. Because the things that matter cost 3 times what they cost him, and they're still going up. That's the piece that doesn't show up in the salary comparison. Housing, healthcare, childcare, education. And here's what nobody says out loud. These are the costs previous generations could absorb on a single income. They now consume 2 incomes and still leave millennials behind. The anxiety isn't irrational. It's a completely accurate reading of a real gap that the headline numbers don't show. But here's what I came to understand from talking to the millennials who were navigating this most effectively. The ones who'd made peace with it. Not by solving the structural problem, because you can't do that alone, but by changing what they were measuring. They'd stopped comparing themselves to a previous generation's timeline. They'd stopped waiting for the moment when it would feel normal. And they'd started building something specific and real on the terms actually available to them. Not the terms they were promised, the ones that actually existed. That shift didn't fix the structural problem, but it stopped letting the structural problem run their financial decisions.
I went into this the same way I went into the Gen X video, expecting to find a list of habits, a set of behaviors I could categorize and explain. What I actually found was a generation that had been handed a broken contract at every major financial turning point. The job market, the housing market, the education system, the investment landscape. Each one had failed to deliver what it promised, and each failure arrived at exactly the moment it would do the most damage. Distrust of markets, choosing experiences over assets, student debt paralysis, income diversification that looked like anxiety but was actually strategy, financial anxiety that doesn't match the salary, and why it's completely accurate. Not flaws, logical responses to a system that kept moving the goalposts. One millennial habit every other generation should genuinely borrow: never depend on a single income source. Not because you're anxious, because you're honest about how things actually work now. And the one habit doing the most quiet damage: measuring progress against a timeline that was built for a different economic era. Milestones your parents hit at 30 are not the milestones available now at 30. Building on that assumption helps nothing. If this gave you language for something you've been feeling but couldn't explain, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Next video is Gen Z, the first generation to learn about money from the internet. And that's both the most powerful financial education any generation has ever had access to and the most dangerous. That one is worth staying for.